Welcome to RealTime Fantasy Sports. This is Starts, Sits, and Sleepers.
Hello and welcome to the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. I'm Jeff Paur, senior writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports, and it is time for Starts, Sits, and Sleepers for Week 17 of the fantasy football season. If you made it this far, congratulations. You likely are in your championship games. It's a huge accomplishment. Hope you come out on top this week. And it's kind of my fantasy mantra, and I really, truly believe this. But when you get to this point of the season, don't get too cute. Go with the guys that got you there. Start the players that have been your go-to guys all season long. Don't go with some obscure player because they have a favorable matchup and you want to try to trick somebody into gaining extra points. Just go with the guys that got you there. And I hope you have a lot of success in doing that. Last week on the show, I went 13-13, tied for my worst week of the season. I will say I had some bad takes last week. I had Matthew Stafford as a sit. Obviously, that didn't go well. So hopefully I do better this week. Overall for the season, I'm 229 and 187 on my picks. So I'm pretty happy with that, but I want to finish strong here and give you a lot of good takes for this week. And I'm going to start with the quarterback position. And my first quarterback start for this week's Jacoby Brissett. He actually had his worst fantasy game of the season last week, scored just 13.65 fantasy points. But remember, he had 21 plus fantasy points every start before last week. I'm not getting too down on him over just a game. And he plays the Bengals this week. This is a get-right matchup for him. They allow the third most fantasy points to quarterbacks this year. The Bengals even allowed Quinn Ewers to throw for 260 yards in his first NFL start last week. So I think Brissett rebounds in a big way. Don't get too down on him last week. So if you survived your semifinal playoff game and you have Brissett going this week, I would feel pretty good about it. My next start at quarterback this week's Brock Purdy of the San Francisco 49ers. Just a monster game last week. 5 touchdown passes. He has 2 straight games with three plus touchdown passes. He's top 30 fantasy points each of those last 2 games. He gets the Bears this week. They allow the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I think this is going to be a high-scoring game. Get players involved on both teams in your fantasy lineups this week. I think Purdy keeps it going. I think he could have another game with 3+ passing touchdowns. My last start at quarterback this week's Tyler Shuck of the New Orleans Saints. He's not a sleeper anymore to me. He had his first 300-yard game as a pro last week. He has 20+ fantasy points, 4 straight games, and 5 of 6. He's a legit low-end number 1 fantasy quarterback right now, getting it done every week. He plays the Titans in Week 17. They allow the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. I like Shuck to have another one of those 20+ fantasy point performances. So if you have one of those banged-up quarterbacks, a lot of guys got hurt last week, I think Shuck could be a good replacement. Now for my sits at quarterback. My first one's Aaron Rodgers of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So he did attempt a season-high 41 passes last week, played a good game, threw for 266 yards and a touchdown, but he really didn't help fantasy teams. He had just 18.2 fantasy points. He has more than 20 fantasy points, just 3 games all season. So he has not really been a help to fantasy teams most weeks. I think he has another one of those mediocre showings this week against the Browns. They're still playing really hard defensively. And overall, as a team trying to win some games down the stretch, they allow the 4th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. So I would just steer clear of Rodgers in this one. My next sit at quarterback is Justin Herbert of the Los Angeles Chargers. Big game last week, but it was against the lowly Cowboys. They've been absolutely horrible against the pass. Before that game, Herbert had less than 17 fantasy points, 5 straight games. Yeah, 5 straight games with less than 17 fantasy points. Not good. He plays the Texans this week. They are just a tremendous defense, allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. I think Herbert could struggle to do much for his fantasy owners in Week 17. My last sit at quarterback, and I'm going to preface this by saying I don't think I would sit him still, but I'm just worried about him producing one of his big games, and it's Josh Allen. So last week, he's dealing with a foot injury. He hurt his foot in the game. I expect him to play this week, but he might have been slowed in that game because he had just 8.2 fantasy points last week. That was his worst fantasy game of the season. He has fewer than 20 fantasy points, 3 of 5 games. That's not like him at all. He's kind of struggling a little bit throwing the ball. And if he has a foot injury and he can't run the ball, that's not good for his fantasy value. So I'm kind of worried about Allen having one of his big games. I think it could be another kind of mediocre showing for Allen in week 17 against the Eagles. They've allowed less than 150 passing yards, 4 straight games. Been really good against the pass lately, Philadelphia has. So Allen could be a bit of a concern for fantasy owners in week 17. My sleeper at quarterback, it's Josh Johnson of the Washington Commanders. I think he's going to get the start this week. Marcus Mariota is really banged up, and Johnson's a bit of a deep sleeper in my opinion, but his track record does suggest he is capable of the big game, and he's produced some big ones throughout his career. And another one could happen this week against the Cowboys. I talked about them in my start section of the video, and they've been absolutely horrible against the pass this year. They've allowed the most fantasy points to quarterbacks all season, have allowed 250 plus passing yards 3 straight games and 4 of 5. So Josh Johnson could end up being a sneaky play, maybe more so if you're looking for a cheap option in DFS formats. Not sure I want to use him at this point of the season in my championship game, but sometimes you have to make desperate choices because of injury or whatever. But Johnson's the guy I might consider. I love this matchup. Think he could be a sneaky play. Let's move on to the running back position. And my starts there. My first one's Javonte Williams of the Dallas Cowboys. He had his worst fantasy game of the season last week. Kind of a theme for me in this video. Some guys who had some down games last week. I'm still not giving up on them. And Williams is one of those guys. He had just 6.3 fantasy points last week. Ran 9 times for just 34 yards. It was the first time all season he didn't get double-digit carries in a game. I think that's going to change this week against Washington. He played them earlier this year in week 7, ran 19 times for 116 yards. Washington allows the 6th most fantasy points to running backs on the season, and they've given up more than 200 rushing yards. They gave up more than 200 rushing yards last week to the Eagles, so I like Williams to get back on track in week 17. My next start at running backs, Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals. He gets overlooked a little bit, in my opinion, but he's been very good for fantasy teams this season. He is 10th overall in running back scoring for the year and 5th his last 3 games. He's really coming up big at the right time for his fantasy owners. He has at least 15 fantasy points, 8 straight games. His consistency has just been outstanding this year. I think he has another one of those really good games against Arizona this week. They allow the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs, and they've allowed 140 plus rushing yards 3 straight games. Brown should do really well this week. My next start at running backs, Ashton Jeanty of the Raiders. The rookie had his best game of his career last week, in my opinion, led the team in both rushing and receiving, showed his huge upside in that game as a dual threat, big play threat, and I think he could have some more big plays this week against the New York Giants. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs and have allowed more than 200 rushing yards 3 times this season. Genty's going to keep it going in week 17. My sits at running back. My first one's Rico Dowdle of the Carolina Panthers. He's really having a solid first season for the Panthers, but he's cooled off a little bit lately. He has fewer than double-digit fantasy points 2 of 3 games, not producing near the huge numbers that he did from earlier this season. I think he's a harder player for me to trust at this point of the year in your championship games, especially this week against Seattle. Really good defense. They've allowed fewer than 100 rushing yards 8 of 15 games this year. I think if you have better options, I would consider them for this week. My next sit at running back, I think it's a guy that's made this list a few times the past few weeks, and it's Breece Hall of the New York Jets. He's really turning out to be one of the bigger fantasy busts this year. He is just 19th overall in fantasy running back scoring, and he's 50th in fantasy running back scoring his last 3 games. He's done next to nothing those last 3 games. He has fewer than 9 fantasy points each of those games, and I have a hard time trusting him this week against New England. They allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs, and they held Hall to just 58 rushing yards in week 11. My next sit at running back is DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears. He's having another decent first season, or actually not his first season, decent second season with the Chicago Bears, but he had a disappointing game last week, scored just 9 fantasy points. He's been more up and down lately than he was earlier in the year. He has less than double-digit fantasy points 3 of 6 games, and I think he could have one of those down games this week against San Francisco. They've been better against the run lately. They've allowed less than 70 rushing yards 3 of 5 games. So I think the Bears might have to get it done through the air in this matchup if they hope to have a lot of success offensively. My sleeper at running back, it's Sean Tucker of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's really become the clear goal line back for the Bucs, much to the dismay of Bucky Irving owners. But if you're a Tucker owner, you like it. He has found the end zone 3 straight games, clearly a touchdown-dependent player because he's done next to nothing besides those scores. But I like him to find the end zone this week against Miami. They allowed 45 points last week, 28 the week before. I think this is going to be a really high-scoring game. So I think Tucker could find the end zone maybe once, maybe twice. And I like taking a chance on him in week 17 if you're looking for a flex option or if you're in a TD premium league. On to the receiver position, my starts. My first one is Jacoby Myers of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He had a rare down game last week. As I mentioned, a lot of the guys on my list this week didn't have great games last week, but Jacoby Myers is one of those guys, and I think he rebounds this week. Remember, he played the Broncos last week, a really good pass defense, and his numbers still weren't terrible. 4 catches for 45 yards, and he was targeted 8 times, so that's encouraging. So I'm still on the Myers bandwagon. I like him to rebound big in week 17 against the Colts. Indy can't stop the pass at all right now. They allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to receivers. They got torched through the air last week against San Francisco. And earlier this season, Myers scored a touchdown against the Colts in week 14 and was targeted 10 times in that game. So I like Myers in a big way this week. My next start at receiver is Juwan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. He has found the end zone 4 straight games. He has really emerged as that go-to target in the 49ers' explosive offense, their top passing game. He is 10th overall in fantasy receiver scoring his past 3 games. He has 13-plus fantasy points, 6 of 7 games, so he showed some great consistency as well. He gets the Bears. They allow the 10th most fantasy points to receivers. I think this is going to be a shootout, as I mentioned earlier, so I like Jennings a lot this week. My last start at receivers, Wan'Dale Robinson. Again, another guy. Terrible game last week, but I think he's going to rebound this week. And I don't know what happened in that game last week for the Giants. They barely threw the ball at all. I don't know what that was, but I don't think it's going to be the case this week because it did not work for them. I look for them to throw a lot more, and I think Robinson's going to be the top target for Jackson Dart once again. He had double-digit fantasy points 3 straight games before last week, Robinson did, and he gets the Raiders. They allow the 9th most fantasy points to receivers this season. So I think the Giants are actually going to throw the ball this week, and Robinson's going to be a benefactor. My sits at receiver. My first one's Quentin Johnston of the Los Angeles Chargers. He returned to the starting lineup last week. He had a big game. He had 104 yards and a touchdown. He was targeted just 5 times in that game, though, and he has 5 or fewer targets 4 straight games. So he's still a bit of a boom or bust play, in my opinion, at this point of the season. And I'm not sure he's going to make many big plays this week against a really good Texans defense. They allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to receivers. I'm not going to start Johnson based off his big game last week. I think a repeat is going to be a bit of a stretch this week against a really good Houston defense. My next sit at receiver is Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. Normally, he's been the most dependable receiver for the Bills this season, but even his numbers have been more erratic this year. He has become a hard player for fantasy owners to trust. He has fewer than double-digit fantasy points 3 of 4 games and 4 of 6. So Shakir has really been a little bit more down than up for fantasy owners, and he's not getting the same volume as last year as well. And I think that makes him a tough fantasy play, especially this week against Philadelphia. They have allowed fewer than 150 passing yards 4 straight games. So Shakir's a guy I'm going to shy away from this week. My last sit at receiver is Marvin Harrison of the Arizona Cardinals. So he returned to the lineup last week. He had just a catch for 14 yards on 3 targets, though. I just have a hard time trusting him in my championship game this week. I'm staying away from him. Even though it looks like a good matchup on paper against Cincinnati, they've actually done good against receivers, fantasy receivers this year. They allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to receivers. They've really done well in shutting down the opposition's receivers. And so I think Harrison's a bit of concern for me. I just don't know if he's worth the risk in week 17. My sleeper at receiver, it's Trey Tucker of the Las Vegas Raiders. Tucker has disappeared since earlier this year, but he remains a top target for the Raiders. And if you can believe this, he actually played 100% of the snaps last week. So he's on the field a lot, and he had 6 touches in that game, 4 receptions, 2 carries. I think that's a good amount of work. And if he gets that amount of work this week against the New York Giants, I think he's going to make a big play or 2 in that matchup. New York allows the 7th most fantasy points to receivers, and I think Tucker could end up being a good fantasy play. Moving on to tight end now, my last position to cover, and it's going to start with the starts. And the first one is Trey McBride of the Arizona Cardinals. I know he's a must start every week. Duh. I get it. It's kind of chalk to say I'm going to put him on my start this list this week, but I had to talk about his dream matchup for the championship game. He gets the Cincinnati Bengals. They have been brutal against a tight end all season long. They allow the most fantasy points at tight ends by nearly 5 more points than the second place team allowing the most fantasy points at tight ends. And I think McBride's going to end up being a guy that wins a lot of fantasy championships this week. I would not be surprised if he catches 15 passes in this game. I'm serious. He's going to have a huge game this week, and I think he's going to be just a smash play for all his fantasy owners. So if you're a McBride owner and you're in your championship game, good work. You're going to be feeling pretty good about having him. My next start at tight ends, Harold Fannin of the Cleveland Browns. He's really become kind of a must start, in my opinion. Third in fantasy tight end scoring his last 3 games. He has touchdowns 3 of 4. He gets the Steelers this week. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points at tight ends this year. I think it's a great matchup for Fannin to keep it going and be a top 5 fantasy tight end once again in week 17. My sits at tight end. My first one's Dallas Goedert of the Philadelphia Eagles. He's always been kind of up and down. He's been better lately, though. He has touchdowns 2 straight games and at least 12 fantasy points 3 straight, but I still don't trust him based on the 3 games before that. He had fewer than 5 fantasy points those 3 straight games before these past 3 games when he's played well. So he's still not a completely dependable fantasy option, in my opinion, especially this week against Buffalo. They've been tremendous against the tight end this year. They allow the fewest fantasy points to tight ends on the season, so I'm not sure Goddard does much in this matchup. My other sit at tight end is the other guy in that matchup, and it's Dalton Kincaid. Looked great in his first game back from injury in week 14. We're feeling good. He's back to his old ways. 3 catches for 34 yards on 5 targets his last 2 games, though. Done next to nothing since that week 14 game when he returned from injury and had a solid game scoring a touchdown. He didn't even catch a pass last week, Kincaid. So I'm not using him on my fantasy teams at this point of the year, especially against Philadelphia. They allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points at tight end. So this is not a good tight end game for fantasy owners, Philadelphia and Buffalo. Both of those guys in that matchup could struggle. My sleeper at tight end, it is Jatavion Sanders of the Carolina Panthers. Scored his first touchdown of the season last week. He is still having a bit of a disappointing fantasy season. I thought he was going to do better this year. He scored double-digit fantasy points just 1 time all year, but he remains a top tight end in this offense, playing the most snaps at that position each of the last 2 games. He has 2 receptions each of those games. I think you could see a bit of an uptick in work this week against Seattle. They could shut down their receivers in Carolina, but they don't do so well against the tight end. They allow the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. So maybe Sanders gets a few more looks and could end up being a bit of a sneaky play for his fantasy owners. All right, those are my start, sits, and sleepers for week 17 of the fantasy football season. Good luck this week. Hope you come home with a lot of fantasy championships. It should be a fun week. Enjoy. And also, happy holidays. Christmas coming up on Thursday. Hope you have a great holiday season, whatever you celebrate this time of the year. And I hope you have a lot of fun and a healthy and happy new year as well. This has been Jeff Paur for RealTime Fantasy Sports.